Thank you, and I'm hoping that my slides will come up in just a moment. But I'd like to begin by thanking all of the organizers, especially Grant Underwood, and everyone who has worked so hard to make this event not simply a conference, but really a shared living experience that is, from my perspective, has been the hallmark of which has really been hospitality and friendship. So thanks to all of you who've made this such a wonderful experience. The goal of this particular lecture is to cover some of the common stereotypes and fears of Sharia, particularly in the American context. Many of us, when we hear the word Sharia, we probably have some kind of scary image that comes to mind. And I think that's particularly the case following the withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan and watching the resurgence of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda there. And so what I hope to do today is to provide us with a framework for understanding what Sharia is, what Muslims mean when they talk about Sharia, what aspects of Sharia, if any, Muslims would like to see implemented in the public sphere, and also what aspects they might not. And then also to think about what Muslim debates about Sharia share in common with other debates about religious values in public life, particularly among Christians. And I hope that by doing that, you will leave this panel with more accurate information about and understanding of Sharia, and hopefully less fear. So, as is my habit, I like to take the issues head on. And so when I was trying to think about all of the fear factors that combine into this, especially in this American context, and a number of our speakers have talked about this, that there's this range of fear from Muslims seeking to overthrow American values or overthrow the Constitution, fear of relegation of women and religious minorities to second-class citizenship. And I'll just pause here to note that 8 out of the 14 speakers at this conference have been women. So the idea of Islam is oppressive to women, perhaps we've started to shatter that stereotype just through this conference. There's also a fear of immigrants and darker-skinned persons, and this idea that there are certain persons who refuse to integrate into American society and perhaps reproduce at a higher pace than native populations, however that's defined. And so these combined fears of loss of native identity, culture, and civilization, and this idea of a threat from within and radicalization and acts of mass violence, I'd just like to note are also often paralleled by fears within the Muslim community of rising xenophobia, racism, and hate crimes, of which we continue to see, sadly, far too many, as a number of our speakers have noted. According to the FBI, there were 176 such crimes in 2019 alone. That's the most recent year for which statistics are available. We live in a time of fake news, alternative facts, and sensationalist headlines and hype generated by interest groups, lobbies, and politicians alike. So, in as much as factual information can sometimes be limited in its usefulness, I do think it's important to have some factual information for framing our discussion. And as many other speakers have done, I'll be drawing from polls and surveys, largely from the Pew Research Center and the Southern Poverty Law Center. In terms of demographic concerns, you might note that even though there's this concern about a demographic explosion leading to Muslim dominance and Islamization of countries, the reality is that in the United States, only about 1% of the US population is Muslim. It is expected to double by the year 2050, but that's to a whopping 2%. If we look at the distribution of immigrants to the United States, what we see is that they do not all come from the Middle East or the Muslim world. We actually have a fairly even split across regions. There's not some sort of massive influx of foreign Muslims coming into the United States. 4 out of 10 Muslim American adults are white, and we have a breakdown here of foreign-born, US-born, second and third generation. One thing I would point to that ties into Professor Jackson's talk on Monday is that 51% of third-generation or more American Muslims are actually Black, and so restoring those voices to this broader conversation is important. In terms of numbers of children, Muslims have an average of 2.4 children. It's slightly higher than the overall average for the U.S. population of 2.1. And so ultimately, I think my point here is that these kinds of demographic concerns that we hear raised by certain parties don't really seem to have much of a basis in reality. Even if we turn to the case of Europe, we find that Muslims overall still constitute less than 5% of the total population. And even if we are looking at numbers of recent refugees to Europe, they only account for about half of all immigrants to Europe. So it seems that our fears oftentimes are far more expansive than the numbers would support. There have been questions about how much that population is going to grow in the years to come, and this particular graph shows three possible scenarios depending on a variety of circumstances that could affect future migration patterns. The worst case scenario shows that the migrant population might grow to about 14% of the total population by the year 2050. And that's still a significant minority and would be much less, far lower than Christians or non-religious persons. And so I hope that looking at some of those statistics helps to lay to rest certain fears about being overtaken or overwhelmed by Muslims. So, what exactly is Sharia? Jack had mentioned earlier that the Sunnah is something you can't go to the library and check out as a book, and the same thing is true of the Sharia. The term, as Hadia pointed us to, means a path to water, and I just want to think about that phrasing for a moment. This idea, path to water, water in Scripture, whether we're talking about the Quran or the Bible, always symbolizes the divine presence. And so the purpose of the Sharia is to serve as this path to water, this path that leads us to God. And another point I would like to make with respect to water is that you can't really pick it up and hold it in your hand. The point of water is that it is intended to be fluid and that it needs to move in order to remain a source of benefit. If you've ever watched animals, you'll notice that they don't drink from stagnant water because they know instinctively that diseases can proliferate in stagnant water. And so I think the idea of Sharia as a path to water encourages us to think about something that is intended to be dynamic and fluid so that it can be life-giving. When we try to define what exactly Sharia is, there are many scholars today who point to the idea of maqasid of Sharia, this idea that it refers to broad objectives or values that the law is supposed to fulfill. And so we have this ethical code that provides guidance in many different directions for social, educational, cultural, economic, and political practices for the Muslim community. Sharia is supposed to provide us with a common code for behavior. It's sometimes phrased as simply as promoting good and preventing evil, which is very open to interpretation. And it refers to matters related to both worship and human interactions. Sharia includes values such as good governance, individual accountability, the provision of social justice, assurance of a fair marketplace, care for the poor and marginalized with special attention to orphans and widows, the provision of public safety and security, the protection of life, bodily integrity and private property, freedom of religious conscience, attention to the common good, maslaha, which is often described as public welfare or the public interest. And you'll note that the connecting point here is that all of these are intended to work together to build and maintain strong and connected communities, not just through the assertion of rights, but also through the fulfillment of duties. So this isn't something that you just take. It is also something that you have a responsibility to give back with. And this is true at the individual level, the community level, and as some would argue, at the state level. As concepts, I would note that these principles, these values, are very comparable to the principles that are outlined in the preamble to the United States Constitution. If you remember, we the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, assure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity. I see many parallels in these values. They converge in principle. I thought it might be interesting to, as Shadi had done, we have some questions that have been asked in surveys to Muslims about what exactly is essential to what being a Muslim means to them. You'll note that number one is belief in God. We also see following very closely behind this love for Prophet Muhammad, that Tahira and Aziz talked about earlier, working for justice. And I would note here particularly protecting the environment ranks very highly among characteristics of what it means to be a Muslim. Following the Quran and Sunnah, we have some dietary issues, some dressing modestly, and interestingly, getting married. And when we compare this to how Christians responded to similar questions, we see that belief in God is the single most important issue for both, 86% for Christians, 85% for Muslims. Muslims ranked working for justice and equality in society third in their list at 69%. For Christians, the closest match was working to help the poor and needy, but that was only at 52%. Big difference in environmental issues. 62% of Muslims identified this as a critical aspect of faith, only 22% for Christians. So perhaps there's some work to do there. We have the importance of scripture, 59% for Muslims in terms of regular study of the Quran and Sunnah, versus 42% for Christians of studying the Bible. One point that is mentioned here for Christians is the importance of forgiveness and honesty. And I would note that those questions were not included for Muslims. And I think that that is a very serious shortcoming of this particular survey, because it leaves a false impression that forgiveness and honesty are not important to Muslims when they very much are. The Quran is filled with exhortations not only to repent, but also to forgive, and reminds us that God is the source of all forgiveness. So in terms of these values, the proper definition of Sharia, not only is there not perhaps much to fear, but these are the kinds of values that would seem to fit in very well with American society. And I think it's also important to point out that the questions that were asked here and the characteristics that are identified are all about what Muslims stand for, not what they stand against. And I think that's an important perspective that all people of faith really need to think about in an era of polarization and divisiveness, is that it's perhaps easier to think about what we're against, but we really need to think more seriously about what we are trying to build and what we want to stand for. Now, many of us coming into this may have expected that I would be talking more about Islamic law. Sharia refers to objectives and values. It's not a concrete set of rules. That elaboration of Sharia into concrete rules is what we mean properly by Islamic law, jurisprudence or fiqh. And the important difference, well, one of the important differences between the two is that Sharia is part of divine revelation, that these are values and objectives that God has provided as guidance and orientation for us, while Islamic law is really the product of human reasoning about divine revelation. And so it would be a mistake to give the two the same level of authority, because we're talking about divine on the one hand and human reasoning on the other. That also suggests to me that Sharia is something that people really need to think about and discuss and debate, so that Islamic law, as the product of human reasoning, can be subject to revision and change as human circumstances and our knowledge bases change. So otherwise stated, Islamic law is intended to be a living and dynamic process guided by this quest to uphold these values, the common good, human dignity, social justice, and the centrality of community across time and space, rather than some fixed set of regulations given once for all time. What do Muslims really think about this? Well, note here that more than half of those American Muslims who were surveyed said that they believe that more traditional understandings of Islam really are no longer sufficient for the contemporary era. And so there is a need for new interpretations to be engaged. And I think there are two realities that are implicit in that opinion. One is that times have changed, which means that the context has changed. And so the ways in which we implement these values and objectives of the Sharia also need to change. And secondly, sometimes there are developments in society, whether in our understandings of the human person or in terms of advances of science, medicine, and technology, that may require new ways of looking at traditional concepts and ideas. So to give you an example of what that looks like in practice, we've certainly had a growth of medical understanding and knowledge about the human body that has led to some changing understandings of how to live out Sharia objectives. One would be the new recognition, relatively new recognition of brain death. That formally occurred in the United States legally in 1968. In the past, Islamic legal scholars determined that a person was alive as long as their heart was beating. But as of 1986, following a statement by the Islamic Fiqh Academy of the Organization of the Islamic Conference, brain death came to be recognized such that legal death was redefined as the complete and irreversible stoppage of the heart and breathing, or the complete and irreversible stopping of all vital brain functions. So what was the driving purpose behind this decision? It had to do with the new issue of organ donation, something that was not possible in the past. And some discussion about that had to occur because there are certain organs that are required for life and there are others that are not, such as a kidney or a portion of the liver. So for certain organs, such as the heart or lung, removing those would kill the patient. At the same time, the organ has to be removed before the person is completely dead, or it will not be usable. So having a new guideline on what constitutes death was established in order to put some parameters into place with respect to organ donations. And it was also intended to be certain that people wouldn't just be killed so that their organs could be harvested. We know that, unfortunately, there is a black market for organs today. So that's not just a theoretical concern, it's a very practical one. And I hope that gives you a constructive view of how Islamic law can be reviewed and revised in light of new information, but still guided by Sharia objectives, here the preservation of human life. So all of that said, perhaps the biggest fear factor that many people have about Islamic law is the fear that it would result in some sort of absolutist vision of what constitutes acceptable human behavior, and that it would be accompanied by harsh punishments for infractions. And that's not a surprising concern based on some of what we see in the sensational headline news. And so one of the things that I want to point out is that there are not just two categories of human behavior in Islamic law, acceptable or prohibited. There are actually five. And that allows us to have a much broader range a view of human behaviors. So we have those things that are obligatory. You receive a reward for them if you do them, and punishment if you do not. There are things that are recommended that bring blessing because they are optional, but there's no punishment if you don't. So it's a recommendation that provides blessing, but not necessarily punishment. There are things that are permitted that do not necessarily have a reward or punishment as an implication. Those things that are discouraged, avoiding which may bring reward, definitely bring punishment if they are done, and forbidden that this is a punishment that is guaranteed both by God and possibly by society. And yet, none of these categories are really absolute. They are intended to be general guidelines, because in the case of a dire situation, the overriding guiding principle is always the preservation of human life. So you still have this underlying objective or value of the preservation of human life, and there may be times when that means doing something that you might not normally do. One case that came under discussion by Saudi scholars was whether or not it would be permissible to use a pig heart as a transplant into a Muslim patient. Under normal circumstances, pigs are considered to be unclean, and so the idea of putting that inside one's body would be problematic. However, if you know anything about medicine, the pig's heart is the closest thing to a human heart that is available. And even the Saudi scholars, who are usually looked at as the most conservative, ruled that the underlying goal of this surgery, which was the preservation of the life of the patient, overrode something that would normally not be permissible and in fact might be prohibited. And so when Prophet Muhammad said that Islam did not come to be a burden, that becomes one way of looking at things that would normally be restricted and realizing that even such things as the 5 pillars of Islam also often have exceptions to them. So fasting for the entire month of Ramadan, if you are a diabetic, which is a permanent condition, is something that is not required because of the harm that that could cause you if your blood sugar levels are not kept at an even level. So the alternative is to feed 2 hungry people for a day so that you maintain the spirit of the fast, which is being able to connect to the poor and the less fortunate, but in a way that doesn't cause you harm. The same is also true for a woman who is pregnant or who is breastfeeding, because of the harm that that could cause to an unborn child or a nursing child if the mother was fasting and was not able to produce breast milk or provide the appropriate environment for a growing child. So I hope that helps you to think of Islamic law in a way that's not just harsh and draconian and, this is exactly the way it has to be, but it's intended to be flexible when it needs to be. It's a religion of moderation, wasatiyya, as many are fond of saying. Those 5 categories of behavior are applicable to a very wide range of issues, personal matters such as hygiene, purification, dietary prescriptions, worship regulations, ritual guidelines, modes of dress. There are public requirements, such as for criminal behavior, financial regulations, including business, commerce, banking, charity, military regulations, international law, family law, including marriage, divorce, and inheritance. When Islamic law appears as part of a country's legal code, it tends to appear most frequently in matters of family law. Sometimes it's included in criminal or commercial law, occasionally in a constitution if the country has one, possibly in a Bill of Rights. So there may be certain things that are written into legal codes, but there are various levels of policing, if you will, of Islamic law. So personal matters are oftentimes a matter of personal choice. Whether you choose to follow something or not follow something is left up to you. Sometimes there may be community support for or discouragement against a particular activity, and sometimes there are certain regulations that make it into national laws, and I think this is where most Americans have their greatest concerns, especially where criminal law is concerned. So as we're thinking about types of crime that are outlined in Islamic law, there are 3 types generally. We have hudud, which properly means boundaries or limits, so God has established these boundaries and you're not supposed to cross them. These are considered to be crimes against God that have specific punishments that are prescribed for them. There are crimes of qisas, which means reciprocity. So this would be crimes against persons, such as personal injury or homicide, that have 3 different modes of punishment. There can be some sort of corporal or capital punishment. There may be financial compensation, called diya, or forgiveness. Forgiveness is also an option. So remember I said earlier that forgiveness wasn't even included as a question in that survey, and yet here it is right here in the legal process. And then finally we have tazir, which means discretionary punishment that's left to matters of public order or the state security. Most of our fear associated with Sharia, I believe, is connected to hudud. And so I hope what you notice I'm doing is that I started with this hugely broad topic, and we're narrowing it down and narrowing it down and narrowing it down, thinking about where the fear is coming from. So I mentioned that hudud, hud is the singular form, means boundaries. And the idea here is that these are limits that God has set that we are not supposed to cross. Historically, there were 7 crimes that were classified as hudud. Theft, which one of our speakers mentioned the other day. Banditry or highway robbery, which is described as causing corruption on the earth. Today that has been expanded to include piracy and terrorism. Rebellion, unlawful sexual intercourse, slander in the form of an unproven accusation of unlawful sexual intercourse. So those 2 things have to go together, which means that if you're going to accuse somebody of having done that, then you'd better be able to prove your case, because if you can't, then you're the one who will be subject to punishment. So there's a checks and balance system that's built into this. Drinking alcohol is also listed, and according to some law schools, apostasy. Many people would agree that the first three in this list probably constitute very serious crimes. The last four are more doubtful to many Westerners today. I think the connecting factor to all of these is that they're all perceived as threats to community cohesion at different levels. Threats to property and safety are clearly damaging to community cohesion, but so are false witnessing, the rejection of common social norms, and the disruption of family units, and even engaging in behaviors that could cause harm to other persons. So this may not be as much of an issue here where you live, but as I often explain to my college students, drunk people are not as much fun to be around as they think they are. One, they tend to be kind of loud, and they oftentimes can be kind of obnoxious, but two, when you think about the impact that alcohol has on the mind, it can lower some of the defenses and controls that you normally have in place in your own mind that would prevent you from committing certain types of behaviors. And oftentimes we find that persons who've consumed far too much alcohol may become not only aggressive, but may even become violent toward each other. So there is a certain community dimension to this. Attention to hudud often focuses on the harsh punishments that have been specified for these crimes, and what's often forgotten, even in some countries where these punishments are being revived as a sort of litmus test of their Islamicness, is that historically there were very strong requirements for evidence and witnessing that had to be followed, and the case also had to be solid. You could not have any doubt about whether or not a crime had been committed. This is the legal principle of shub. Any doubt as to whether the person knowingly and intentionally committed the crime, whether they had a free choice to commit the crime, or even if the crime had actually occurred, if there was any doubt about any of those things, you could not assign this HUD punishment. You could still assign a discretionary punishment, but not the harsher punishment. And so as one of the speakers had indicated earlier, I believe it was Jack, the court records are full of these kinds of cases where the doubt card, so to speak, is played. You know, the judge may doubt that the person who was accused of doing something actually understood what they were doing. There may be doubt on the part of the person who's accused as to whether or not what they had done fit the parameters of certain crimes. So if we think back to that example of theft that was mentioned the other day, the object stolen had to be valued above a certain minimum value. It had to be movable. It had to be non-perishable property in a protected location that would require some sort of effort and intent to steal. So if any of you ever saw the Disney film Aladdin, if you think back to that scene where Jasmine is in the marketplace and there's this kid who seems to be hungry, and so she picks up an apple and hands it to him, and then this very scary looking person says, oh, what do you think you're doing? Are you going to be able to pay for that? And she says, well, no, I don't have any money. I came here from the palace. And he grabs her by the wrist and gets ready to chop her hand. That's not how it worked. Islamic law is not about vigilantism and people going out to the marketplace and assaulting each other. First of all, food couldn't really be stolen or qualify as theft because, remember, this underlying principle of the preservation of human life. Why would a person steal food? They steal food because they were hungry, and they might need to find something to eat, and if they don't have any money, that preservation of their own life overrides someone else's protection of property. So in terms of witnesses, historically, in order for a HUD crime to be proven, you had to have 2 adult males or 1 adult male and 2 adult females as witnesses. Testimony had to be given without coercion or torture. It would be nice if certain regimes in Muslim-majority countries would remember this. Any confession given under coercion or torture is not permissible as evidence because the person was being coerced and tortured. And there are certain things that require heavier documentation. So that accusation of sexual misconduct is an important one. Instead of the usual 2 adult males, you actually need 4. And they need to be witnesses to the actual act, which, frankly raises some questions about what these people were doing and why they were watching this. And they didn't do anything to intervene. I could ask the same question about that poor woman who was assaulted on the train in Philadelphia last week with all of these bystanders. Why didn't somebody step in and intervene? So one other point is that any witness could withdraw their testimony at any time up until the implementation of the punishment. And so what I'm trying to establish here is that this system had certain built-in parameters that were supposed to provide protections to the accused by requiring very strict guidelines for witnessing and evidence. And those parameters are not always respected. Today, we could point out Pakistan and Iran as two countries where if you have a woman who makes an accusation of rape, she can actually be charged with having committed sexual misconduct based upon her confession, namely her report to the police. So we're seeing ways in which certain aspects of past systems are being re-implemented, but without the fullness of the parameters that existed historically. And there are also cases of families, and I'm citing Pakistan here in particular, who have accused women of being disobedient or rebellious toward their fathers or male relatives, not toward God. And they accuse them of sexual misconduct in order to have them jailed as a pressure tactic, trying to push them into marriage or to abandon inheritance claims or to give up certain property rights. And I've seen the same thing in a few cases in Saudi Arabia as well. So although I'm working to provide a more informed framework for understanding Sharia, I'm also upholding the fact that that's not always implemented comprehensively or the way in which the system was intended. There are very real problems in some places that should not be ignored. What gives me hope is that there are women in many of these places, including Pakistan and Iran, who are working at many different levels of society and in the government to try to bring attention to these realities, and they're working to redress these issues and put justice at the center of the matter. So paralleling back to what Shireen was talking about yesterday. You may have noticed that there was one sort of crime that might jump to mind for us that was not included as a HUD crime, and that is the crime of murder. And we think about that, God is the one who claims sovereignty as the giver and taker of life, which is infringed upon by murder. But it's because there's also this recognition that murder is a crime not just against the individual or claiming God's power, but there's also a family that is left behind. And so murder is actually considered a qisas crime, one of reciprocity. The family has a role in determining whether to ask for capital punishment, for financial compensation, or to forgive the perpetrator. And that may have an impact depending on what country a person lives in. So in Saudi Arabia, for example, this is very much part of what happens when a case is tried. And there are instances in which a family will choose to forgive the perpetrator rather than ask for punishment, because this is a way of demonstrating their faith and their confidence that God will provide justice in the afterlife, but that they want to make a different kind of statement and not cause even more disruption to the community than has already happened. So for those of you who are interested in learning more, I would just point to this book that John Esposito and I recently published on Sharia, What Everyone Needs to Know. If you're looking for more information about the role of Sharia across the full spectrum of human and community life. And in closing, as I prepare to turn the floor to my very esteemed colleague, Dr. Asifa Qureshi-Landis, I hope that what I've shared with you today has been helpful for providing a more informed framework for Sharia. And I'd also like to point out that inasmuch as there are people and organizations in this country working obviously very hard to stir up fear over a possible implementation of Islamic law as part of the American legal system, the reality remains, to my knowledge, that there is no Muslim or Muslim organization that has ever asked for that. So it's a totally artificially generated fear. In fact, in a 2016 poll that was conducted by the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, I found that only 10% of American Muslims said that Islam should be the main source of law. 27% said a source, but not the only one. And by comparison, we have 12% of Protestants who said that Christianity should be a main source or the main source of American law, and 29% a source. I'm not really sure what Christians are referring to when they talk about Christian law, because my understanding of Christianity is that it's not intended to be a legal system. It's also not clear who would be responsible for interpreting it or according to what methodology. So there are also more Muslims than Protestants who said that religion shouldn't even be a source of the law at all. So there really is no consensus among American Muslims about implementing Sharia as any form of law in the United States. So I have to wonder if rather than stirring up fear of others, we might be further ahead to commit ourselves to ending this kind of polarization and misinformation and compete in good works and community building, which is what the Quran guides us to do, that we should compete with each other in good works. Our hope for a better future, I think, rests in people like those of you who've attended this today. You have refused to give in to hatred and fear and have responded instead with loving embrace and hospitality. And so as you have this wonderful saying at the entrance to the university, that we all enter in a spirit of wanting to learn, and I hope that you'll be able to move forward now in a spirit of service. Thank you.